Hello, this is Jacquelyn Ekern with Eating Disorder Hope, and we are excited to honor National Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And because of this event, we have invited Dawn White with Timberline Knolls to share with us her expertise on nutrition. And we'll dive into that shortly. I just would quickly like to introduce Dawn and have her tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to be here to talk with you and everybody watching. I am a dietitian here at Timberline Knolls, and my role here is to work with individuals who struggle either with eating disorders or with disordered eating or some type of aspect of their relationship with food that they're struggling with. So I provide that support through one-on-one sessions, through challenge meals and what we call food discovery, through nutrition groups. And I also provide support there from a Christian perspective through a group called Food and Faith here. So I have been here a little over 4 years and just really enjoy the opportunity and the work that I get to do here with these amazing people that come to TK.
Thank you, thank you. Well, with that, can you just address why nutrition is such a crucial component in eating disorders?
Sure. So as we know, eating disorders are directly affecting our relationship with food. And as such, nutrition is a big part of that. I actually spent, I've been a dietitian for a long time, and my first role, and the reason that I really got into it is because I was amazed at how the human body works, and wanted to find something in a way that I could kind of explore how things work with the body, and nutrition kind of just fell right into that. And I joke around, one of my favorite classes was biochemistry, because it was so fascinating to see how the body worked and then how nutrition worked with the body and all the feedback systems that it has. And so I have this huge appreciation of food and all of the benefits that it does for us from that physical perspective. So that's kind of where I started with this role in nutrition many, many years ago. I think today we take it for granted or even forget about how important food is in our health and well-being. Sometimes I think we take it from this perspective more of we have to avoid foods or this fear of food, and that's how we're going to get healthy. And we forget about all of the important things that all of the food groups and nutrients do and how they work together to really sustain our health physically, and I would argue our overall whole being as well. I found it so interesting as, I've been studying more about, nutrition over the years, just the effects of starvation and what it has on us. And I always think it's eye-opening to even mention that Minnesota study that was done where, they took all of these people who had no problems with physical illness, no mental health issues at all, and they put them on a starvation diet. And that diet wasn't even not eating at all. It was eating about half of their energy needs. And over time, they saw all kinds of things start to affect their health and well-being. So the physical things like getting cold or weakness or dizziness or fatigue or slowing heart rate, all of those physical things that started to show up, recognizing, I think on one hand, that our body's doing that to protect us as long as it can, right? It's trying to slow things down to sustain the vital functions, but also just the toll that nutrition, lack of nutrition takes on us. And then I think what's even maybe more so eye-opening about that is the effects that it has on our mental well-being. And they showed all kinds of things from depression and anxiety to even some obsessive compulsive issues and isolation and thinking about food all the time, and all of these mental issues that came up with regards to simply the lack of nutrition. That was the one thing that was changed. And I love that study because it just gives some really concrete information about the importance of food in our life. And we tend to forget that as we go to food or the restriction of food or trying to control food for all kinds of other reasons. I think it's easy to forget the importance that it has, not only in our physical health, but our mental as well.
Absolutely. I think of that study a lot too, and it's very informative. So can you tell us why the nutrition aspect keeps us healthy? What is going on in our body? So I guess what I'm trying to ask is if I'm entrenched in anorexia and I'm not wanting to eat for various reasons, how can I embrace what foods are good for me and take that nutrition in a sort of loving way to my body rather than seeing it as the enemy?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we go back to just the basics of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, that's what we tend to talk about right away. All kinds of judgments can come up around these nutrients for various reasons, and people can be in different places with that. But if we go back to the basics of what they do, carbohydrates' main function is to provide our body with energy. And if we're having, sometimes we're really good at pushing through all the feelings we're having, but if we're having that lack of energy, we can only really sustain that for so long. So those carbohydrates provide that main energy for our body to function. And, I feel like a lot of times we might go to protein, like, oh yeah, we can do the protein, but the carbs, I'm a little bit afraid of those. I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
And I think one thing we forget is that protein can't really do its work and what it's really good at unless we have the carbohydrates there to meet the energy needs. So carbohydrates and proteins work very well together to sustain us in getting the energy, and then allowing protein to do things like build our immune system and our muscles and keep our heart functioning and all of those types of things that protein is so good at. So we want a good balance of that carb and protein. And then fat in there as well, that helps our body absorb the fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A and vitamin D. We hear all kinds of things about vitamin D and vitamin D deficiency nowadays. Lots of ways to get vitamin D, but one of those is through our diets and having some fat there so that it can be absorbed into our body and used well. So we need that balance. And one of the things that we do here to help ensure that is we build this meal plan where we have an entree, and that entree consists of all three of those, what we call macronutrients, those main nutrients that are giving our body energy. And that way we can get the balance of all of that so our body can have what it needs to sustain itself. So how does that work with eating disorders? So we have all of these judgments and stuff coming up around foods. One of the things with that too is to remember this all foods fit mentality, right? To pull back from the judgments of good or bad around food. Because when we start judging that food is good or bad, it actually starts having more power over us. Would you agree? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So it's really hard to find this balance. And, we go balance, variety, and moderation. It's really hard to find that balance, variety, and moderation when we're having judgments of good or bad foods. So we look for that balance of carb, protein, and fat, and then we allow all foods to fit in that so that we can have that enjoyment. We can choose balance and not start letting it control us. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about eating disorders is we have this reason that we're using to control our food, right? And I think it's important to kind of be curious about that, but these reasons that we're looking at to use our behaviors, right? And one thing I hear all the time is that, yes, this is the reason, but guess what? It's not satisfying that, right? Maybe in the moments, maybe, we have these times, but in the long run, one of the things people might say is I'm using this for control, but really I feel out of control. So I think really remembering that eating in and of itself and nutrition in and of itself is what actually leads to helping us have that healthy control again, not restricting that eating. Gives more of this false sense of control that just leads to chaos.
I love that you touched on that false sense of control. I know in my own eating disorder recovery, on the psychology front, you deal with addressing and accepting what we are in control of and what we are not in control of in the environment. But the shift to focusing on food or weight, often in eating disorders, feels so temporarily satisfying to individuals. So when one is stepping into recovery or contemplating it or in it, how do you sit down and take in that nutrition and let go of that sometimes strong delusion that this restricting is keeping me together? This is who I am. If I let go of that, who will I be? How will I cope?
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point as to how it's such a multidisciplinary thing that really helps with recovery, right? Because yes, on my end, I'm going to encourage you to eat and to trust the meal plan and to really look at what are your reasons, like why is it meaningful for you to do this right now? What does that life look like for you that this is really keeping you from? So I'll touch on all that, but also that psychological component of really understanding what is happening and our identity. So often we find our identity in that eating disorder. So really finding out who we are and our values and our goals and exploring what does that look like and finding hope. We talk a little bit, that's a big word, but finding what hope looks like for you, because that's really truly where it's at. However, eating does tend to be what starts that process, right? Because it provides the support that our brain needs to start processing and thinking through all of these other deeper issues that are going on that have led to that eating disorder itself. So.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up hope, because I know you run a very cool hope and faith, or excuse me, food and faith group. And I'd love for you to share about how faith can be incorporated in our diet and in eating disorder recovery.
Yeah. So food and faith is a meal that we do here, and we do it over a meal, and we bring in prayer and thanksgiving and gratitude all around food to experience what that is like and what might be showing up around that intention around that meal. And then during the meal, we talk about scripture. We just open up scripture to themes like grace and what does grace mean in recovery? What does it mean that Christ has given us undeserved favor, and how can we start accepting that? So often we're not very good at giving ourselves self-compassion and grace. So what does it look like to receive that and to start receiving that from the Lord and then giving that to ourselves? So we'll go through different scriptures on grace. And another one, we talk about freedom in food. Again, another big word, freedom. What does that even look like? But talking about freedom in food and just how throughout the New Testament, there's this focus on not getting so rigid with our rules, but seeking the kingdom first. And what does that look like in our recovery to recognize that God has given us food, God has given us these things as a way of meeting our needs. Not something we need to control, because he has it in his hands. And what does it look like to shifting that to seeking him first versus all of these rules and stuff around food and our behaviors? And then, of course, going back to grace and all of that as we explore all of this. We'll touch on things like body image and how we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and his provision and generosity and abundance in it. So we go through a lot of different things, and really it's a very open group where people can read scripture and kind of share and discuss what's showing up for them in that.
Oh, that sounds so wonderful. And it sounds like with faith, it really opens the door for a more compassionate perspective towards our body and appreciation of it, rather than falling into sometimes seeing it as a billboard representing ourselves.
Yeah. And I think it speaks so much to that identity piece of who we are, too, more than just this outside thing, this outside appearance. There's so much deeper there, and the fact that we're children of God and who he created us to be and the purpose that he has for us. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. So also, I know a lot of families have issues around meals with someone that's struggling with recovery or not even in recovery yet. How can those folks be supportive and loving with the individual? And are there any hard and fast rules? Don't do this, do that, or?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. You know, caregivers, it's hard to see somebody, you know, really struggling with this, and what do we do? And I think often as caregivers, we want to just like take control and make it happen, right? And honestly, that's one of the last things that's really helpful in this. I always encourage, as I do family work here with a family therapist, and exploring what does it look like for support at home. One of the first things we'll do is ask the person struggling with the disorder, like, what is helpful for you at meals? What does that look like? Here I am, somebody that cares about you, that wants to support you in recovery. What would that look like for you? And getting feedback from the individual themselves as to, you know, this phrase is helpful, this phrase isn't helpful. You know, sometimes if you see me struggling, I just need you to be there and not say anything. You know, it could be a whole bunch of different things. The other thing that I always encourage is asking open-ended questions. So instead of saying, you know, you need to eat that, this is on your meal plan, or so on and so forth, maybe questions like, it looks like you're struggling. Are you struggling right now? Is there something I can do to support you? I'm here for you. Just kind of reminding them that you are there as their support. It's really difficult when we get into that power struggle. Yes, you want to be holding them accountable and asking those questions. But if it's starting to come to a power struggle, that's a place that really just doesn't lead to too much change. So as much as you can ask those open-ended questions. And if you recognize somebody struggling, then getting them the help, the outside support that they need as well, and bringing in the treatment team, including their therapist and possibly dietitians.
Absolutely. So that open-ended question idea is so great for offsetting that I'm going to control you feeling that can create this instead of cohesion. I think that's really good. When people dine out, how is that for, what kind of nutrition choices do you suggest when someone's just out of treatment and early recovery, and how do they manage that? And how do they manage comments from people that aren't really informed or part of their inner circle of support that throw them off?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, one thing I would encourage, if you are getting ready to go out to eat, as much as you can plan ahead is so helpful in those early recovery days. As much as you can have an idea, sometimes that doesn't happen and we're just thrown into it, but as much as you can plan ahead, you can kind of, you know, look at a menu, know what you're going to have, be ready, go in, do some of your coping ahead skills that you've learned in treatment, and how to manage those things, and then proceed to go into that meal. From the food aspect, I always encourage, number one, if you can, try to get in touch with that side of you that tastes food. What might look or sound good to you if you can get in touch with that at that moment. So one of the phrases another dietitian used to use here all the time at our challenge meal is, you know, try to forget the rules for a moment and just think about what looks good, sounds good, or tastes good, you know. So if you can get in touch with that side, I highly encourage exploring that. And then the other thing you can do is use the meal plan. If you're on a meal plan, if you've been given one by your dietitian, it's a nice framework to help even in the dining hall, or dining out setting, because it gives you a guideline as to, okay, these are the things that still make a balanced meal. So we're still going to aim for that as we're eating out. And then, you know, the comments and the things that show up, yes, having somebody who can really support you is helpful. Reminding yourselves of the truths versus the lies out there. I think, you know, it's a lot of that self-talk sometimes, reminding, having information in front of you, attending podcasts, really staying in touch with what the truth of things are, so that you can reframe those other things that come up in conversations everywhere around us.
Those are fabulous suggestions. Thank you. And then I think my last question for you is, you know, earlier we talked, you and I privately, about that it's social, there's joy in food and it's part of our culture. Can you help people get excited about that again and recognize that food's an intricate part and they can re-embrace that if they've stepped away from seeing food in a, you know, a way to celebrate and be close to other people too?
Yeah. Yeah. So I talked about why I love nutrition, but I think the other thing I love about food is just all the reasons why we eat. Like, why do we eat? So yes, there's nutrition there and we do it because of that sometimes. But if you step back and think about it, what are all the other reasons that we eat? We connect with people over a meal. We have traditions in our family or our cultures of certain foods that we have. It's always so interesting to me, the memories sometimes that we get from food, sometimes good and bad, right? We have memories and experiences around food. And then that final thing of joy, like food is meant to bring pleasure. There is pleasure in food. And I like to think about it this way. If it wasn't meant to bring some type of pleasure, then we'd probably all just be eating dog food, right? I mean, like, I hate to use dogs as an example, but you know what I'm saying? We have just like, okay, here's your nutrition for the day, and here's this, you know, brown dry food, and you're going to eat it, and that's it, right? But we have this beautiful diversity of colors and flavors and textures. And there's such an art to it too. And you can see art in food. And some people that I've worked with have connected or reconnected with food around that art sense of food as well. So there's just this beautiful diversity that I think speaks to the fact that we taste and enjoy food. And we can give ourselves permission to do that. And so I'm always encouraging people, yes, there's the struggles there, but really start working on giving yourself permission to enjoy the foods that you're having, to truly taste them, to really think, do I really like this food? Truly, not from a fear, even health perspective, but what does it taste like to me? And how can I find joy and pleasure in that? And there's a lot of beauty. And really, once again, when we do those things, that's where we find balance, variety, and moderation. So.
I agree. And it enhances our relationships and even lets us start experiencing more joy again in our life, of just pleasures that break up our day. Mealtime can be just a nice break and fun, and you get to often interact with others and all the colors and taste, really get into the taste. It's wonderful.
Yes, yes, it really is.
So
yeah,
Don, go ahead.
No, and you know, it just made me think of something a little bit different too. Like there's a place for food in our lives, and I think we need to recognize that food should take some time in our lives. But when it becomes problematic is when it's taking all of our time in our lives. So we can food as like this place of joy and pleasure and planning and cooking and all of those things that go into finding balance in that. But when we get to a place where it's consuming all our thoughts as to, you know, how do I restrict or how do I this or whatever, that's when we start getting in trouble. So giving food its place in our lives, I think, is very helpful as well, to let it have all the things that we talked about, you know, the traditions and the cultures and the nutrition and the flavor, letting it have its place, but not letting it take over our whole life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That it's an aspect of life, but it's not our whole lives.
Yes.
So thank you very much for your time and expertise. I learned a ton today and I'm so excited about it.
Good.
Can you tell us a little bit about Timberline Knolls and why you love it and why folks might want to consider you for seeking treatment, in your opinion?
Sure. I think one of the strengths at Timberline is we offer this co-occurring approach. So, you know, when you talk about eating disorders are not only nutrition related, right? There's so many other issues that tend to happen and wrap around that eating disorder and why we're using those behaviors. So I think one of the strengths of TK is that we do offer this co-occurring approach where we're addressing mood and substance and eating disorders and whatever else might be showing, trauma, whatever else might be showing up around that. So the programming kind of covers across that board. The other thing that I really do like about TK is our approach to food. We really work in our meal plans to, I guess, normalize is kind of what we call it, but I guess try to find this relatively normal, if that's, I don't know if that's the right word, but way of eating. So instead of, we don't do exchanges here. So instead of doing exchanges, we have like an entree and item side type of meal plan that we use. So still giving the accountability of making sure our meal plans are adequate, but trying to move more towards like, what would a normalized meal look like and how can we use that as our meal plan? So I do really appreciate that as we try to work into moving away from numbers as much as possible in ED recovery, but still giving some structure, that cast for a broken leg kind of thing, you know, to the meal plan here in TK. So those are two things I appreciate about here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that approach with the food too. It gets away from the controlling, restricting aspect that at least I really struggled with in my eating disorder. So I think starting right in treatment, let's start adapting to more normative eating and not over measuring and all of that.
Right. Yeah.
If you want to reach Timberline Knolls, you can call them at 888-206-1175. And you can also reach them at their website, which is timberlineknolls.com. And with that, we just hope you have a wonderful National Eating Disorder Awareness Week. Thank you to Timberline Knolls and you, Dawn, for sharing this gift of information and encouragement about nutrition and eating disorder recovery.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.